just me for. Thanks for being here. Okay, everybody ready? We're 11 o'clock. We're going to stay on, respect everybody's time. Okay. Good morning. I would like to call this meeting to order. The time is 11 a.m. Welcome to a study session of the St. Helena Unified School District Board of Trustees. Today is Monday, February 13th, 2023. I am Lisa Pelosi, Board President, and I would like to introduce my fellow trustees and district staff members. Vice President, Mrs. Jeannie Kerr, Clerk to the Board, Mrs. Laura Simon, Trustee Mrs. Sean Mora, and Trustee Ms. Jean Marie Wolfe. Also joining us is St. Helena Unified Staff, Superintendent Mr. Ruben Aurelio, Chief Academic and Human Resources Officer, Mr. Christopher Heller, Chief Business Official, Mrs. Andrea Stubbs, St. Helena High School Principal, Mr. Ben Cinto, RLS Middle School Principal, Ms. Corinne Cox, St. Helena Elementary School Principal, Dr. Carmen Emery, and St. Helena Primary School Principal, Mrs. Rebecca Rocha. A copy of this meeting will be available on our website at www.sthelena.unified.org. Oh, and I'm sorry, Mary, I apologize. And Mary, Director of Curriculum, Miss Mary Allen is here with us as well. Okay, item 2A, we're going to do approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Motion carried. Okay. Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand and join me. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Do you want to do like a roll call vote for the agenda? First and a second. Do we need to all say aye?
I probably, it wasn't on my script, but I can do. Erica's not here. I do think I have to backtrack on the motion to approve the agenda because I got a first and a second. So I'll do a roll call vote. Or actually, Mr. Aurelio, why don't you do that, please?
Trustee Wolfe.
Aye.
Trustee Mora.
Aye.
Trustee Simon.
Aye.
Vice President Kerr.
Aye.
And President Pelosi.
Aye. Motion carried. Thank you. Okay, item 4A is the presentation on district-wide student achievement, and I'm going to ask Mr. Heller, but I do want to just, on behalf of the board, just say thank you to you, Mary, and our principals for assembling all of this information to present us today. I know it was a lot of time and effort, and thank you for making it approachable for us as well to read and understand, and we're just really grateful, and we're here to support you, and we're going to ask some questions, but it's all in the spirit of collaboration, and that's what we're here to learn from you and see how we can help our students.
Great.
Mr. Heller.
Good. That's a great intro. Well, good morning, district staff, Board of Trustees, and the audience today. We're going to take an opportunity to look at several data slides in academic areas and obviously ask questions and be able to have a dialogue around the data. We did provide a comprehensive data report that had a lot of background information, but we're going to focus today in two particular areas, the disparity in between white and Latinos subgroups, known sometimes as the achievement gap. So we're going to focus on that as well as our overall mathematics performance. I want to note that on this slide right here, even though there is historical dating information dating back to 2015, just remember that our community has endured quite a bit in the last 7 years. We've had a community tragedy that occurred at the Veterans Home. We've had numerous fires and smoke and loss of instruction days there. And of course, throughout the conversation around data, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, which is probably about 2.5 years worth of loss or limited instruction that we have to account for. So some of our slides will show that a little bit further in depth. And these data points measure at one point in time. We all recognize in this district that we're about the whole student and that these data points are just one measure taken at one time that kind of show us where our students are performing. So The other point that I'd like to make is just that we are a fairly small district and that one student sometimes represents a percentage point or a percentage point and a half, in some cases maybe even up to two, so that a one student differential could make, or 5 students differential can make up to a 10% difference in our scores. So just kind of keep that in mind as you look at increases or drops in data. It could be measured in a certain number of students. All right. Please stop me if you have any questions, and otherwise I'll just continue on as though nobody were listening. All right. So in talking about our student enrollment with the mentioning of our different cohorts and how the percentages may change, you could see that we range roughly from kinder 51 up to our junior class, which is 122 students. And we are in a declining enrollment phase in the district, but we mitigate that right now currently with the district of choice process, which admits students who do not live in the district boundaries based on a lottery process. Our demographics, the thing to note on this slide, this shows the district demographics, is that at our previous demographic collection and presentation in 2019, our white and Hispanic populations were roughly about the same at 47%. Now there's an increase that you could see that's a little, a little bit of a difference now that our Hispanic population's about 52% and our white is about 43 roughly. All right, let's go into the achievement data. So on slide 6, this is a CASP comparison to 2022 with the number of students who met or exceeded. So think about level 3 and 4 met or exceeded. And this shows the data from the state. And you can see that there's a little bit of a dip statewide, and you can see that our numbers reflect that as well in the district. So this is prior to the pandemic and then post-pandemic data. Just give a second. Okay. This chart shows the overall percent of students who met or exceeded by subgroup. And so you can see that we have several different subgroups in there. Our FEP would be reclassified fluent English proficient. So students that started entering our school system with a different language other than English and then have been tested and reclassified as English proficient. And then you have our English learners, English only, and socioeconomically disadvantaged. And you can see those scores. You can see there's a disparate number between our English learners, our RFEPs, our socioeconomically disadvantaged, and our English only. So that's what this chart illustrates.
I just had a question on this one. I think there was a definition on a different slide or the other addendum. Is the English learner 12 plus, one of the definitions said that they have been in the United States for 12 months, greater than 12 months. So it's, I'm just trying to understand so that this would include anyone that's been here 12 months or greater and is an English learner.
That's correct.
And if the other category is newcomer.
Correct.
So where would a newcomer show here?
I don't have the newcomer on this slide. I have it in
Okay.
the backup documentation.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that I understood those definitions as I went through there. Well, that would be logical.
They can, and we do historically have them take the English language arts assessment with all the accommodations and modifications.
Okay.
So typically we have them take it, Carmen. I know you're new to us, so sorry.
But they could show up under socioeconomically disadvantaged, would that include
Correct.
newcomers?
Several of our students
Right.
fit multiple subcategories, subgroups.
Right. Okay.
They'll show up in the other piece of data that we have for all ELs, but for our 12 plus, to give kind of a real good representation, we know our newcomers are going to not do as well, and we anticipate that, but we do want to see a growth measure for them. So when we do this one, we're looking at the English learners because they've been in the United States or a public school system for over a year, and this gives us another gauge that we're looking at.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So before we got into the mathematics slides, I wanted to provide an overview just to kind of highlight some of the work that we've done in the district prior to the pandemic and through the pandemic. When I was hired in 2015, I did have a math background, 2016, and so one of my first charges was to help in the area of mathematics, or provide what limited information I could in helping in that area. But so we did a lot of work prior to the pandemic, and it was evident in some of our scores that I'll show you in a subsequent slide. We did some training with Stanford and the professor Joe Bowler on the growth mindset, and it really had an impact on students, and we saw positive results in our scores and in how students viewed mathematics. A lot of students actually reported that math was their favorite subject, which if you think back to a lot of students' experiences, I'm not good at math, I don't like math, I get frustrated, that math was met with an idea or a concept of a constant problem solving, and we make mistakes and we just try again. And it really was met with students in a different way, that we felt that there was success in the classroom, and it was evident in our CASP scores. So with that, we also had some trainings with West Ed focused on academic vocabulary and mathematics. We had some coaching that we began with UC Davis and coming into classroom, providing observations and feedback. And then we also developed what was called at the time the Math Task Force, and we really worked on data and standards and really began a TK-12 conversation in the area of mathematics, because mathematics is just this unique subject in schools where it is, if you think of a pyramid, it's the building blocks starting with kinder, and each year it just adds on, adds on, adds on. It's a very unique subject. So if you miss a layer anywhere along the way in that pyramid, you have a gap in there, and that erodes at that structure. So the pandemic did derail some of that, but we did see some positive growth that I'll highlight in another slide. Okay, this chart shows the county's comparison with the state. The blue is level 4, so that is exceeded. Green is level 3, met. Yellow is nearly met, level 2, and red is not met at all. So this line graph, the state is at the top, showing the comparative percentages, and you can see as a district, we have more blue and green than our neighboring districts, which is good, and we have a very small not met category of about 15%. So in this area, about 60% have met or exceeded. Then mathematics with the state and the county, again, going back to the lead in there, this building block where we are missing 2.5 years. You could see this is our new data. This is our baseline data. So as a result of coming out of the pandemic, and this is our first CASP assessment, this is where we are. We have about 38% that have met or exceeded district-wide. So it's a little bit better than the state, a little bit better than our neighbors, but probably not where any of us would want it to be.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
When we're looking at these scores and thinking about our special ed students, can you give us a little history on, do they participate? Is their score included in this?
Go ahead. You know better, yeah, but go ahead.
So we have two categories of special ed students. You have the mild to moderate, which are usually your RSP students that are in resource class, and then you have moderate to severe that are in usually our SDC classes. So the ones that are mild to moderate take this assessment with accommodations and modification. The other students that are in the SDC class, depending on their cognitive level, will take what we call a California Alternative Assessment, and it will not be part of this.
Thank you. And with those modifications and accommodations, where do you typically see them scoring?
In reference to our special ed?
Yeah, in reference to special ed, are they typically in the red or yellow category with modifications and accommodations?
They are lower.
Okay.
For the most part. And I believe it's in the backup documentation, Laura, that I have it all in reference to broken down by special ed as well.
Great. It just helps me think about our different populations and where they're scoring. Thank you.
There we go. This graph, let's focus on the far right to begin with. So this tells a story from 2015 to today, and the dotted lines are the pandemic years. So those are just through lines, and you can see the high school did test in English language arts during the 2021 school year. If you focus on the far right, that is the scaled score for level 3 met for the state. And that's, so any score above that shows that you have met or you're proficient in that particular area in English language arts. And this is by grade, not by cohort. So this is just third grade every year, not by the students in there. So it shows us kind of the grade level performance at those grades. And you can see it's pretty, I mean, if you look at the line graph, it looks like from that 21-22 to the level met, it looks like it goes down, but that's actually a good sign, because then the score in 21-22 is above the level 3 met. So if I use the 11th grade as an example, if their score of 2583, is that right? 25, 26? No, right, but the level 3 met is 2583. And then our score is 2653. That shows that it is higher than the level 3 met. So the left to right decrease is actually a good thing. Does that make sense? Because it's comparative to the level 3 met. And you can see, you know, traditionally throughout the years there, we have had increase in in 15 to 16, 16 to 17, and 17 to 18. And then moving into mathematics. So if you focus starting on the left side here, this is kind of some of the growth that we were seeing throughout the years in the progress through the Joe Bowler, growth mindset mathematics. You could see that in particular. I believe it's in 8th grade. If you follow that line, the second line down, you could see that there's growth from 15 to 2018-19. So there was some real solid gains being made by our students. The dotted lines are the pandemic years. And then you could see like how the lines have decreased to 21-22. And then the left to right here is an indication of not meeting level 3.
A question, when did the Joe Bowler training, when was it implemented?
I want to say
Versus trained?
16, 17. Yeah, 16, 17.
And I think if I may add, I think it's important to note that 2017 and 18, those were the major fires. That was the major fire year that we had. And we also had the power shut off, so we had disrupted education for that school year.
And throughout the years in mathematics, one of the things that we focused on as a support for students is we at the high school and middle school level, and they may or may not talk about that, but I want to introduce that, is that we did have math teachers become interventionists for a period to push into classrooms for a period of time. And we still have this in effect right now, as we have a TK5 dedicated math specialist to work with and pull out students in mathematics and TK5. So that may be mentioned, but I also wanted to highlight that there's a lot of work being done in mathematics and a lot of supports being provided. Okay, I will turn it over to Mary.
So what you're looking right here at is our students that take the summative LPAC, which is a English language assessment every year to see their growth in language. And you can see the percentage of students that progressed a level based on each school site. So that's exciting to see. We had approximately 216 ELs take this assessment. So every single EL student needs to take the summative every year. It's an annual assessment. until they're reclassified, then they no longer need to take this. And looking at this and viewing it, it's on scaled scores as well. So we look, there's 6 levels that they can hit: level 1, level 2, level 3 low, level 3 high, and then 4, and I believe it's level 2 high and level 2 low. So there's 6 levels on the dashboard. And so this is based on, even though they could be in level 3, if it shows growth from level 3 low to level 3 high, then that's a positive growth. So you're looking at all of the score, the percentage that moved up in their language acquisition. Language acquisition, as you know, it takes 3 to 5 years for oral proficiency, and it takes like 4 to 7 years for academic proficiency when a student of any language comes into the public school system and they're a non-English speaker. I think the other thing to note here is that most of our students start out strong when they're looking at the oral growth, start out strong in Spanish, in speaking. So when we see growth, usually on the LCAP, it's going to be in speaking. So oftentimes teachers, ourselves, anybody in the community, you would think, oh, this student is perfectly proficient in English, when truly they're not in the academic English. They're able to orally tell us that, but reading is the lowest score in the LPAC. So they can read for the most part when they get in the upper grades, but comprehending what they're reading is the difficulty that our students have with the LPAC. So there's 4 components. There's speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Our strength is oral and speaking, where our students for our district are the lowest is in reading. So it just is something that we're continually working on, and it makes sense. And I think the other thing to remember when you're looking at the LPAC is that our students, if they're coming from monolingual homes, they get 6.5 hours typically of English, meaning they're speaking English, they're hearing English, they're reading English, and then they go home to a monolingual family. So that just adds another difficulty to a student in reference to learning the language, because you have 6.5 hours to be concentrated language development. So just to kind of put that in perspective. There's nothing to say anything wrong with that. It's just keep that in mind when a student is here, is that that's the only time they're hearing English other than when they're out playing a sport or they're out in the environment. But right now for us, it's just within the school setting.
You don't have to answer this question right now, because I know we want to go through the slides. It might be a better time later in the meeting to discuss it. But I'd love to learn more about what the EL program looks like, especially for TK through 8. I've had the privilege to be on the high school campus, and Ben has shared with me a lot of good information about how ELs are supported at the high school. But maybe we can hear a little bit more about how ELs are supported.
Absolutely. And
Thank
I
you.
think it's I'm sure our principals are going to tap in a little bit with the EL support, because that's been a lot of
Great. Thank you.
a lot of our direction. So now I'm going into the achievement gaps. Here, what you have is socioeconomically disadvantaged versus our students that are not socioeconomically disadvantaged. The federal poverty level for a family of 4 is $30,000 a year for a family of 4. And looking at RLS, not RLS, but looking at here in St. Helena, we have approximately 13.9 of our Hispanic population is in poverty, and 4.8 of our Anglo population is in poverty. So it matters. It matters where a family comes from. And because you're looking at so many different factors that are there in reference to who's got to work, who's got childcare, what happens after the home, after they come home. So just so many different factors. But I just wanted to put this up there because it is one of our subgroups. It does get measured, and it does matter. This is for English, and this is for math. And when we talk about closing the achievement gap, we're not talking about bringing up, down. We're talking about bringing both up in reference to growth. So oftentimes you hear people saying closing the gap, and they're saying that you're going to dumb it down for the folks that are at the top. No, not at all. You're trying to bring everybody up. Next one is our English language learners. This is strictly just our English language learners that had taken the CAS. We had approximately 98 students take the CAS. 97 of them, just to kind of get to the point, were 12 plus. One was a newcomer. So when you look at this, you're looking at 98 students compared to students that are English only. Again, looking at this. Math is no longer just computation. And, you know, if you come into any math class, you're going to realize there's so many word problems. There's so much that they have to do related to language. And they also have to do a performance task, a couple of performance tasks, which requires them to articulate their thoughts on how they got that answer and why it's the best answer. So naturally, you can understand why it would be more difficult for them to have higher success on some of these scores right at the very beginning of learning English language. And then here you're looking at race and ethnicity based on the CASP. And again, I think this gets to the factor of, again, if they're coming to a monolingual household after 6+ hours of English, you know, we know language matters. It has nothing to do with the competency of a student, nothing to do with the competency of a student. It has to do with the factors. And the factors are language. The factors are they going home and having to do any child care? Do they have the capability of getting tutoring after school? Is there a transportation bus issue? What is happening that you see that our students that are white tend to have higher scores across the board? Our students that are Hispanic do not. So it is something that we always seriously look at, and we always need to do a much better job of what factors do we have control of and what factors we don't have control of. And we do know that parent education matters as well. So how do we support how do we support parents at home to help their students beyond the school day? Because 6.5 hours is a lot. If you're learning language, going to Mexico and you're trying to think about what they're talking to you about, and then they're trying to teach you content, how difficult is for an EL student? So of our Hispanic population of 500 and whatever it was, 219 are ELs. So that's quite a few. So I just, you have to put that in perspective. Same thing for math. And then I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. Rebecca, you'll just tell me when you want me to flip the slides.
Okay. So this first slide, you can see that subgroup that started in 2017. This is measuring English learner progress on the LPAC test. That is a test that we give our English learners every spring. So you can see that it's following that cohort that started kindergarten in 2017, and you can see the scores improving for that cohort by 2022 with that arrow going down. These are our results from the California dashboard. So because we don't administer the CASP at the primary school, that starts in 3rd grade, for our English language arts and math, that is based on the 3rd grade scores. So that is interesting because, of course, those were our students for 3 to 4 years, but we do not teach them in 3rd grade. So the other thing you can't tell from this data is because it's only, I believe, 78 students, it doesn't break it down on the dashboard by subgroup because it's only 78 students. We were significantly higher in both areas than the state average, but you can see how the 3rd graders did. And then the English learner progress, 50% of our students, this was last school year, were making progress towards English language proficiency, which was considered medium. We were, I compared, oh, no, I'm not reflecting, sorry, that's later. I'll tell you that later. So this goes into that English learner progress. So you can see the percentages at each level, which is color coded. This is referring to what Mary was talking about, like how much progress they made. So that's that. And this is our local summative assessment, the MAP scores. Our scores are actually higher in math than they are in language arts at the primary school. And so you can see this is comparing our white students with our Hispanic students. And this was from the fall, that the students took this test in like early November. So in terms of reflections, in terms of academics, English language arts and math, like I said, our math scores are higher. Our teachers work very professionally in professional learning communities where they're constantly asking. This is part of our CAPS network training. They're focused on 4 questions every week when they meet for 80 minutes. What do we want students to learn? How will we know that they've learned it? What will we do if they haven't learned it? And how will we respond to the students that have learned it? They have really fine-tuned that in math. We're working on that for language arts. We're farther ahead in the game in math, which I'm sure you can see it proves in our results. Last year, we started making sure that all of our staff was trained in GLAD strategies for English language arts, and that GLAD stands for Guided Language Acquisition Design. Basically, that is a way to teach, like Mary was saying, it's really difficult for students to learn a second language and learn content at the same time. So those GLAD strategies are ways that teachers present content in a very interactive, engaging, and way that's understandable for students to learn language and content at the same time. And they're also highly engaging strategies for all students, not just for our English learners. We also developed this year really clear cut points and for our interventions for what would help us determine which students were considered intensive and then strategic. So we also refer to those as tier 2 or tier 3. So tier 2 would be a student that's below grade level, but they're not intensive. Tier 3 means they're significantly below grade level, and those are the students that go to the reading intervention teacher or the math intervention teacher. And so we have very clear cut points that we developed this school year to help determine how are we responding when students aren't learning, and then within those cut points, progress monitoring, so that we're constantly measuring their progress to see if they're working towards meeting their goals. And that progress monitoring happens for literacy every 6 weeks. In math, it's a little bit more fluid because the teachers are giving exit tickets every week on the math goal that they were targeting. And so those students are moving in and out of that math intervention teacher. Sometimes it's the same students because they're always struggling, but they're getting that weekly data on that exit ticket, like a quick dip measure. Did they meet what we were focusing on this week? And that's how we determine who goes to those intervention teachers. I'll just jump to the next column because it goes better with what I was talking about. So for our English learners and that achievement gap data, those GLAD strategies that are really focusing on our English language arts standards, that is also helping English learners. So that's also going to help our students progress in their English learner proficiency. I did look because I wanted to know, because last year was my first year at the primary, what the scores were in 2019. Before the school closures and before COVID. So we were actually 1 point higher last year than we were in 2019. Something that we did start this year, we didn't do it last year school-wide because we were so focused last year on our students being so far behind in reading. We did an extra dose of reading groups, and this year we really, every school needs to do designated ELD for at least 30 minutes a day, and that has to be a separate time where your English learners are going to a dedicated teacher just to work on their English language development, and it can't be a range of more than 2 levels. So Mary had referenced that LPAC test, there's 4 levels. So we can't put a newcomer in with a level 4 student. So last year, that's an extra 30, we were trying to find time during the school day. This year, we, at the end of the day, all of our students go to, we call it language club. So our English learners go to ELD, and our English only and our RFEP students, those kids that have been redesignated, they're going to an enrichment or an intervention. So we have all hands on deck. Some teachers are doing a newspaper, while other teachers are doing ELD. And those ELD teachers, we met at the beginning of the year and we looked at the students' LPAC scores to examine where are they being held back. Like Mary said, a lot of our students scored high in listening and speaking, but it's the reading and writing where they're struggling. So that ELD time is really focused on getting them moving farther along in the area that they're struggling in. And it's also tied to what they're doing in language arts. So that they're supposed to be integrated. So the teachers are working on, let's say, writing an informational paragraph in writing, but those ELs are really struggling with writing a complete sentence. And so during ELD, for example, they're really providing those scaffolds to, write a topic sentence on an informational subject, but giving them that added support during ELD. Looking at that graph that measured the English learner progress levels, the students that were level 4, which would be the highest on the LPAC, that was 10% of our students. The goal is that anyone who's a level 4 gets redesignated. We were able to redesignate all of those students. There are 8 of them this year, and so they'll be recognized on Wednesday night at the board meeting. And then once they get to level 4, we're looking at local measures, DIBELS scores, writing assessments. So we really focused on those students during ELD that we knew were a level 4, but let's say they needed to really get more proficient in writing. So that was something really positive, that 10%, now they're moving out of that category. In our PLC work, we've really had a lens on our Hispanic student data because we were obviously seeing the data when it was broken up, like on the MAP test. But what wasn't happening was our teachers are so diligent in their PLCs. They, for example, in math, when they're going to teach a SMART goal on a prioritized standard, they are giving all the students a pre-test, and then they're measuring progress along the way, and then they're giving a post-test, and they enter those scores in columns: intensive, strategic, proficient. Well, an idea that we had this year was to color code our students, because it's one thing by subgroup. It's one thing to see how they do on the MAP test. That's not really exactly tied to what we're teaching in our curriculum, even though it's standards-based. So we really wanted to make sure that we're measuring the progress of those subgroups with what we're teaching in the classroom. So that just really helps them to understand as they're entering that data, and they're entering, like, here's a student that's a Hispanic student that's not an English learner. Let's say they scored intensive. Well, it's not a language issue. So why isn't that student learning? Or, and we have a color for students with disabilities. Is the fact that they're not scoring proficient tied to their disability? Or great, now we moved all of these kids, that were ELs over to strategic, or it's just really helping them focus on who their students are and meeting their needs. And on that note, with the MAP data, in this fall, we looked at all of our students' scores from the spring within the cohort. So for example, first grade looked at the kindergarten scores, second grade looked at the first grade scores. Knowing that we had this achievement gap, they combed through those students to figure out who was where, which Hispanic students were at or above already, which students were near, almost able to be moved over. And so then they targeted students to focus on. And I can say that we went back when they took the MAP in the fall, and our subgroups had increased. Like in language arts, they increased by 11% in language arts, and in math, they increased by 19%. So we also tested those kids separately and gave them a pep talk, and just really gave them breaks and gave them little snacks, and it's just really having that focus. We saw the results, and the teachers were really, they felt so good about the work they had done, because we hadn't really focused on, they saw the data before, like, oh, achievement gap, but how do you move those kids? And they really saw them move. So that was really exciting.
One quick question on those designated, the language clubs. What's
Yes.
the average student-teacher ratio?
Well, because we're such a small school, they're very small. So our ELD groups are probably 8 students, whereas in a typical school you could have 24 kids. But because we're so small, and also we've been able to use some of our kindergarten teachers to help during that time. They're doing some of the enrichment classes, so that's reducing the size of all of the groups.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I have another question for you.
Yeah.
Thinking about the historical EL data that we're going over and what you've explained about the end of the day, the different classes and levels of support, is this something that the primary has always done, or is this a newer support system?
I do know that they did ELD before. I think it varied by the grade level. Some teachers, like I know first grade was doing more integrated ELD, where they were pulling their kids at different times of the day to support them. But what we decided this year was, also because we have so many interventions, we have math intervention, we have reading intervention, so that means kids are constantly moving. In order for those kids not to miss any content, we had to do it at the same time.
Okay.
We had to protect that time. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
I just want to say thank you. That was not just the data, it's very impressive, the jumps you're talking about, but it's impressive how well on a weekly basis or 6 weeks, like depending upon which measure, that you really understand each child. And that's just amazing. So well done.
All right. I guess it's the turn of SHUSD. I'm getting used to SHUSD Elementary. So what you see here is the English Language Arts CASP test by the different subgroups. So you're going to get to see it in a little bit more in a percentage base, but this is based on the scale scores. What you'll see all the way to the right, the column, that's really the measurement columns. That's where third grade, you will see that yellow line that goes all the way across. A little bit like we were seeing the other data before of the district, where the far right column is really giving you the goal that we're headed for, right? That we're trying to reach for each different grade level. So the bottom yellow line there, I believe, is the one that shows you where third grade should end or land, and then fourth grade in the gray, and then the fifth grade is that last column. So that is a measurement section. And then you can see by different subgroups, our English only students, the very first set of columns for third, fourth, and fifth grade, doing well, as you can tell. And then our English learners, there's a definite achievement gap. You also see the student numbers in the parentheses, which gives you more of a perspective on how many students we're talking about. IFEP is the initially fluent proficient students. So when our students come to us and they've had a language other than English at some point in their history, then we give them an English acquisition test to figure out what level they're in. If they're at a certain level where they are considered doing as well as any other English-only student for that age group, then they're considered initially fluent proficient. So they're not considered English learners anymore, and they do not need to have the LPAC assessment every year. That's the IFEP. The RFEP is our reclassified students. So these are students that are English learners, do take that LPAC every year, and then they reach a level where they are reclassified, which Rebecca was talking a little bit about reclassification. It happens throughout our system because students come to us at every stage, at every grade level. And so it's just a matter of that LPAC test giving us that announcement that they're ready. Does it match with all the other qualifications for a student to be reclassified and no longer be considered an English learner? And so you see that sets of columns. And then the next set of columns, or the next group, is our white students. And compared that to our Hispanic students. Again, this is only in the English language arts at this point. I just lost it on my computer. And so if we can go to the next one, you'll see the same perspective, but under the math CASP test.
Sorry, on the column with the IFEP, the data set, what was the
IFEP,
EO at the end?
English only, yeah.
So I guess I was confused on if that was any different than the English only column up above.
I did not believe
Sorry,
that
not up
English only
above, on the
students were
left.
in this data. But maybe that's something that we need to take a look at.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because the numbers don't look different.
No, I have to get my head wrapped around that, so let me think about it, because this comes from the state assessment, and they break it down to just EOs, and then they break it down to the IFEPs, EOs, and RFEP. So I have to kind of wrap my head around why those numbers are a little different, so hopefully I'll have the answer by the end of today.
So here we're looking at the same test, only we're looking here at both English language arts, and then on the right you'll see the math. But they are separate here by English learners versus English only groups, and you can see a clear achievement gap here between the achievement of our English learners versus the English only students in both math and language arts.
So just to make sure that I'm understanding, if someone was an English learner and has reclassified or was a IFEP, where would
They would not show up any longer.
they do
in
not
the
show on this chart?
English learner.
Perfect.
They
The English only.
I know that they were for some time including, the state was including RFEP data in with English learners. I'm not sure where we land on that this year.
How this is broken down on the state test is it does strictly just EOs. They didn't have to take what we call the initial LPAC or the summative LPAC. So these are just straight EO kids that didn't come in with anything. And then the other column is just the students that have had a year of instruction that have been here in the public schools.
At least a year. Mhm.
And so this does not have the IFEP or the RFEP in it.
And the following slide, oh yes. So this one is is specifying just the group socially economically disadvantaged and comparing that to non-socially economic. So you can see that achievement gap there from English language, the first two columns, and then the next two, which are showing the math differential there. This one is specifying students with disabilities versus non.
So these are your students that are your mild to moderate, your RSP students, or they're on a viable.
And so in looking at this data, obviously what stands out to us is that differential between that those two, our largest subgroups, right, our white and our Hispanic students, in both English language arts and in math. So we continue to, our English learner subgroup is not quite as large. It is mostly included in our Hispanic, obviously in our Hispanic group. So we look at that differential, and we're still, for English learners, we're doing integrated and designated ELD in the classrooms. Our classroom teachers are responsible for making sure that they are breaking down the curriculum to a level where our students can access it. And so that's the integrated, is the supports that teachers do for students to access the science and the social studies and the math. And then the designated ELD part is for students that require, our English language students that require us to really, to really focus on their language acquisition in order to be able to access and produce in English, right? So they do both within the school day in small groups, and very small groups, because some of our students will only have, most of our English learners are at the 3 level. We only have 3 newcomers this year in our school that came in with 0 English, and they're from 3 different countries. So, so the primary support for that is very difficult. But we do have a paraprofessional that supports those 3 individual newcomer students at different times, just for the basics. Because when you come in with 0 English, I mean, just asking to go to the restroom or needing to sharpen a pencil or where are the pencils, all these basic pieces, especially when our students are coming from countries that aren't Spanish speaking either. And so our teachers would not necessarily know their language. So what we've gotten very good at is Google Translate on the fly. You'll see some of our students with the teacher's cell phone. The teacher will talk and give the command or the sentence that the teacher wants, and it translates for the student right on the spot for those little things. And this is a unique circumstance for us this year. I don't think we are very accustomed to that. These kids are doing amazing. It's really interesting to look at, but it is a new dynamic when they come to us without their primary language not being one that a teacher can access.
And are these 3 separate families then?
Yes.
Are they students? Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, 3 different families, 3 different countries.
Carmen, can you speak to the slide, page 32? It's the reported disability versus no disability. I'm looking at students with disabilities, ELA, and non-students with disabilities, ELA. So we've got a higher percentage of students with disabilities in the blue and green categories than students without disabilities. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that is actually a typo. I think those are supposed to be switched.
Okay.
And that would be a Mary Ellen blame if I did that.
Yeah, that's a switch.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, and I just saw and knew. So
And that would be the same for math, I'm assuming? Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Thanks for catching that, but that's true. That would be a very different dynamic and happening only at
curious.
She's. I thought one of the questions that I thought you might ask about was back when we were showing the slides of reclassification, and you'll see that for the elementary school there's more reclassification happening. I just wanted to mention that is a result of it starting in the primary and moving up, and also that the reclassification tests do change according to grade, and they become way more complex. So once we're into the 6th grade, the language, the level of language, English language, that our English language learners are requiring in order to get a MET in that LPAC test is probably to a level that a lot of our English students would not be able to pass. So it becomes very difficult. So we're in kind of a race with our students, wanting them to reclassify beforehand, because it could become a hindrance to not get them before, if we have the time. Obviously, it takes years to dominate or to master a second language. So if we have the time, where these are students that we've had since the primary, we are in a race to make sure that they get reclassified before they are faced with that test that is so much more complex.
I'm going to get back to this particular slide as well as the other slide. Is they are correct. And the reason is you have 19 students that are disabled in the category of having a disability, and 214 students that don't. And so of the 19 students that had taken the assessment, they did score higher than
our
214.
mild moderate.
And I guess I would put that, first of all, we have a couple of great teachers at the elementary school that are dealing with our special ed, but also there are some accommodations for students that have a disability, and one of those accommodations is text to speech, as well as being able to read aloud. So sometimes when they're taking an English test and it's a writing assessment they need to do, it'll read to them what it's asking them to do. and then the student has to respond. Those are some accommodations on the test online that other students do not have, and it's based on their disability.
Well, and additionally also is in students with disabilities, a lot of those students are speech
I was
only,
going to say that.
right? And they're included into that. So academically, they don't have a learning disability other than their language. Does that make sense?
So
Right?
along that,
Sorry, yes,
Yeah, I had the same thought.
Correct.
yeah. but
along that
that's-
same
is what it
line,
is.
could you touch briefly on accommodations for our EL students? Like when they don't know a word in English, can they click it to see what that word is in Spanish? Can they have text, the reading of the text to them? Things like that.
Yes, there's a lot of accommodations that happen for our ELs. As a matter of fact, if they're in two categories, if they're disabled, let's say they have a disability, and they're an English learner, then there's two components. There's listening and speaking in one component and reading and writing in another component. Let's say they have a disability and it truly is around reading. They have dyslexia or whatever it might be, and it really is impacting their ability to show their knowledge that they truly have, then we can exempt that particular component from the LPAC testing. But in the state testing for the CAS, there's bilingual dictionary, there is read aloud, there is text-to-speech. There's certain things that they get. They don't get the, what we call the major modifications because they don't have a disability, but they get several. And a lot of it is in their language.
And that's all identified individually.
So you feel that the major modifications that our students with disabilities receive help them to be more successful on the CASP than our EL students? Because I guess my question is, if our EL students are given some accommodations and modifications, why aren't they performing better on it since our students with disabilities are performing better? It's just what's going, so I'm thinking about.
What I'm thinking might help if I send after this particular presentation, the accommodation list of what
Yes.
students, all students can get some designated supports, ELs can get some additional designated supports, and then special ed can get some additional. I can honestly tell you, by the time they get to high school, our ELs and our special ed students that are mild to moderate rarely need any designated supports. So it's just more in the lower grades, they get those supports and then they start weaning as they get older. But not every single disabled student needs a support. So it is based on, it's individualized based on their, their disability. And it also for ELs, not every single EL needs all the supports that are out there. So it's all individualized. Then the administrators as well as the special ed teacher, EL coordinators sit down and go through each and every student to determine what will help them show their knowledge. We don't want the test to deter or be a hindrance to show what the knowledge they have in their head. And so that's what the accommodations and modifications are for, is to be able to let them show what they know.
But
Thank you.
That's also why we do that English language development designated and integrated, is because our ELs have to access academic English in order to really decipher that really heavy, complex text that they're reading and writing. And so that I think that it's a very different subgroup. Whereas our students with disabilities, like I mentioned, a lot of them their disabilities is a speech and language, not an academic. And so with our English learners, it's accessing that academic English.
Yeah, and my question isn't to point fingers, it's to really understand.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Understand the accommodations and understand, just to get a better understanding of how students experience the CASP.
I was just going to add that a lot of our ELs, unfortunately, don't speak a lot of Spanish. So to think that like they could translate, they would, a lot of those kids wouldn't know the word in Spanish. Because if you think that they're starting preschool is all in English here. And especially if they have older siblings that sadly only speak to them in English, we're seeing that at the primary, that yes, on paper they're ELs, but they don't speak Spanish fluently. And so it's kind of presents the subtractive, they're not bilingual, sadly. It's kind of the subtractive language because they're going to have to prove that they're proficient in English, but some of those accommodations wouldn't do anything
help
for
them.
them. Yeah.
Won't help them.
Thank you. We need to take a 5-minute break, please, and then we'll be right back at 12:05. Thank you.
You allowed him to put it back down, you allowed him to put it back down without,
Look, it was on my collection list too, number 6. Ben, deadbeat, $20.
oh my God.
That's so funny.
He didn't allow me to bet without money down.
Oh. Yeah. Totally get it. I know I didn't learn anything in my school.
Run the club. Terry O'Leary, though.
Sure, okay.
I didn't put it in the slide.
No, that's fine. So you're gonna give me like,
Do you want me to test? No, I can. I know, but do you want me to test if you can hear me?
okay, so we're not gonna do the other addendum, just this present.
Okay.
Yes.
Testing. Okay. Sean, to get to your question, it is the opposite. So I missed the two numbers. So the higher number is the EOs, and the lower number is the IFEP, RFEP EOs.
So EO shouldn't have been on that.
Yeah, it should, but how the state has it is, I don't know why they're combining it that way, but it's a lower number than just straight EO. I know, it's interesting.
It's really challenging. I mean, and you guys do this for a living. Well, that's why.
It's,
Yeah, right, exactly. Derek's back there, we're good, or?
yeah.
We got 1 minute and then we'll get started. Just, I don't think I need to wait for Derek. I don't, is he back there? I can't see. No, I think. Okay. I think, it's okay. I think we're good to just start.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We are back, 12:05. Dr. Emery, thank you very much for your presentation.
President Pelosi, I just have one last question.
Oh,
if you don't
yes,
mind.
sorry.
Yes, sorry. So this is a quick one. So when you were talking about the reclassifying the students quickly, just because of the test, just the test being harder and things, is there like a trigger or something so that they're reclassified, but then they're taking the test and it is harder, and that for some reason they're not able to get what they're, the reading is difficult for them and stuff. Is there a trigger so that you know that, or does that even make sense, my question?
I'm not positive on that question. I can't really, I don't understand
Well,
really
so
the
I'm just like
question.
saying, if we're trying to reclassify quickly in order to avoid the tests being, so that they're up to speed for the tests as they get harder, is there a point where the test is becoming much too harder than where they're at as far as their development in reading or comprehension, or?
And that's why they don't pass it, you
Well,
mean?
yes. Or why they're having a difficulty.
So for reclassification, when it comes to our students in the elementary level, it's not just the LPAC test, right? The LPAC test, it has to reach a certain level, which is a 3 or a 4, in order for us to look at other criterion to see if our students can be reclassified. So, and for that, the CASP test, the state test, is part of that. So if we can catch them, I don't want you to think that we're like trying to just quickly reclassify students, because obviously we won't reclassify them until they're really ready. But if we can catch them before they leave elementary school, and they meet the requirements, which is the certain level of LPAC, and then on top of that, a certain level in our CASP assessments as well, then we can, they're kind of released from having to have extra remedial or ELD at the middle school that might take the place of an elective, that might keep them from other learning experiences that they might have. And at the same time, the test that the English acquisition test, the LPAC test that they will have to take in the 6th grade and above, is more complex. And like I mentioned, it's in many ways more complex than our CASP tests are, our state CASP tests are. So we feel like they could get stuck and really struggle to get out of that classification. I don't know if that's answering your question.
And I think to just tap onto that is that once they're reclassified, it's not like it's over and done. There's
Right.
4 years of progress
Monitoring.
monitoring to make sure that they're having success in their classes.
And they
Because the
continue
idea of
progress.
being an RFEP means that you're at the equivalent to be able to access the academic curriculum taught in English that an EO student would be able to do. So we monitor that, state law, monitor it for 4 years. Are they having success? Go back to the table. If they're struggling in a subject, why are they struggling, and provide the supports that they need. So there's still a path as we go
Yeah, they
forward.
won't fall off our line of sight.
Perfect, that's exactly
And the
yes,
state
yeah.
acknowledges the difficulty, because if you look at level 3 in the LPAC, it's split into 2, because they know that you're not going 1, 2, 3, 4. They take 3 and they split it, because they know that progress is challenging and difficult for our English learners. So you'll see that as well. I wanted to go back to clarify accommodations versus modifications, especially when we're talking about test scores and these assessments, that they're very particular about what those two things mean. When you accommodate an assessment, you're not changing the scope of the assessment. An example for an English learner, if they're using a word-for-word glossary, where they see a word in English, we provide them the exact same word in Spanish, but we don't provide a definition of the word. And that would be an accommodation. because you wouldn't expect for a kid who's not an English learner to get a definition if they clicked on it. That would change the scope of the test. Modifications on these assessments have to be written into the IEPs or the individual learning plans. And that's the only way they can access that. So our students with disabilities would have potentially modifications to those assessments. Tests being read to them would be a modification.
Thank you. Okay, RLS. Corinne, please.
So this is similar to the same chart that Carmen went over, and you can see that these are the ELA scaled scores broken down by our subgroups. And the English only is the group that has the highest scores, and it's actually higher, as you can see, than our white students. And we also have our RFEPs doing well, and that's about what we were just talking about, which is the fact that once kids are reclassified, we want to make sure that they can achieve at the level of their average peers, and you can see that they're above. There aren't any on there in 6th grade simply because if the numbers aren't big enough, we can't include the data because it would identify who the students are. So we have enough RFEPs in 7th and 8th grade that we can see that once they're reclassified, they're doing really well, and are above the level that's needed, and are basically the Hispanic students are also doing well in 7th grade and 8th grade in ELA, but have a big drop off in 6th grade. And that can be for a variety of reasons. Typically, as you can see, our 6th grade scores are lower anyway because of the transition to the middle school and a lot of other things that happen at 6th grade, including having multiple teachers, as Carmen just talked about at length, the difficulty of what they're being tested on compared to in the elementary school. It's much more complex. And the level 3 on the far right is where they should be. So you can see that in 6th grade, our English only students and white students are above where they should be or at what they should be, and the other subgroups are not. In 7th grade, virtually every subgroup is where they should be. In 7th grade, the kids who have ever been EL students are just a hair below, but overall they're doing really well. And then in 8th grade, they're all where they should be in all the categories, except there aren't enough in EL 12 plus. And there aren't enough actually that's the only one where there aren't enough. And the reason there aren't enough, and you can see that there's 22 English language learners, 12 plus at our school. And 3 or 4 years ago, before we changed the way we do English language development at school, we had about 46 students typically year after year. And so we are doing a lot of very targeted work with our English language learners, both in classes, integrated, and in separate classes designated in order to reclassify students. And our reclassification levels have really worked. As you can see, it's only 6th grade. There aren't even enough 7th and 8th graders to have a line in that category. We do have 7th and 8th graders, but there are so few that they don't even show. So as they're moving through RLS, the work that we're doing is really helping us to reclassify despite how difficult the test is. And they do have to get a 4 on the LPAC, and then they also have to reach a score on the CASP that many of our English only students are not able to reach. So it's quite challenging and complex. So in English, our Hispanic population is doing, the longer they stay at RLS, 7th and 8th grade, the higher grades especially, they're doing quite well. If you switch to the next one, however, you can see that overall math is a bigger struggle for everybody. Our English only students are not where they need to be in 6th grade. Our white students are the only group that is at the level 3. The other groups are all below. The English language learners, as you can see, are well below where they need to be. And then our Hispanic students are struggling across the board in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And our English only students are actually doing at least as well as our white students. So it's not necessarily, it's the language that they speak when they come to school that has the biggest impact, as you can see here, not necessarily their ethnicity, because obviously the challenges of learning a second language it's difficult. If you can switch to the next one. And this shows the achievement gap in ELA and math for English learners versus English only. And you can see that our English learners basically are, the vast majority of them, close to 2/3, are not meeting the standard in English language arts and also in math. It's even a bigger group that's not meeting the standard in math. So we're very concerned about that population of students, and the achievement gap that you can see are English only groups in both ELA and math. In ELA, it's about 67% or so, 68%, and in math, I'm sorry, there's a glare, I can't quite see it. I think it's 50 something percent in math, and nobody on our English language learners in English language arts. And just to discuss that, Mary, I'm assuming that when you put this together, you're not talking about students who've been reclassified, they're pulled out?
They are pulled out. Yes.
Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background on English language learners, the reason that you don't have any green or blue in the English language learner category in English language arts is because if they score green or blue, that allows them to be reclassified, and they're pulled out. So you will never have anybody at that level because they'll be reclassified if they're able to get to that. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? They're changing cohorts, right? So they're no longer, they'll be considered RFEP, reclassified, and they wouldn't have showed in this slide at all. So it's possible, since it's based on English language arts, not math, you can see that there's a tiny number of kids who scored higher in math that still count as English language learners, because again, reclassification is not based on math, it's based on ELA. So I just wanted to explain why there aren't any in that group. There never will be. It's impossible for them to be there, more or less.
You could have some long-term ELs that land in here. You could potentially.
In the math one,
Right.
but if they're scoring high enough in the
Then
CAS,
they would be reclassified.
they would reclassify, so they wouldn't show. Exactly. Thank you. Mary? And then this is the economically disadvantaged versus non-economically disadvantaged. So our economically disadvantaged students are not doing quite as well as our non-economically disadvantaged, but there actually is not a huge gap there. There certainly is a gap, but it's not a huge gap. And I think that probably has a lot to do with the fact that even our economically disadvantaged students are mostly from pretty stable backgrounds. Many of them have been in our school district for a long time. In other school districts, often economically disadvantaged students bounce around from school to school, which really affects their achievement. And here they have stability in their lives, at least in terms of their education, probably not in other areas of their lives, but in terms of education. This one has to do with disability versus non-disability, and the students who have disabilities, although they are getting accommodations on the MAP test, they are still not reaching the same level as the students without disabilities, either in math or in English. We actually have a bigger chunk of exceeded in math, but less meeting the met or exceeded category overall than in English. Math is not quite, for whatever reason. And again, it's not a lot of kids, so you might have some students with IEPs who are considered students with disabilities who are really great at math, but their disability might be in the area of language arts. If you just have a couple of those, it's going to change because we don't have that many. As Mary mentioned in the very beginning, with our very small class sizes and cohort sizes, it doesn't take very many kids to completely change the data. And our students with disabilities, let's see, what are we on? So we're on English learner versus English only. And again, you can see that our English learners are really struggling here in math, particularly. And then in ELA, those are the kids who then reclassified. So the ones that scored in the green and the blue probably reclassified after that test. They would have scored high enough that we would have been able to reclassify them. And then our English only in ELA, we actually have a very large chunk of students exceeding. As you can see, more than half of our students met the exceeded level, and then another very large group that met. So it's about 70, 54, 80 something percent, 82% of our English only students are meeting or exceeding, and that is not the case for our English learners. It's also not the case for math, because again, the gaps in math that occurred during the pandemic and the interrupted learning during the fires and smoke and school closures and all the other things that we've gone through have affected those foundational skills. What we really see is the group that everyone dropped a level. I shouldn't say everyone, that's incorrect, I'm sorry. Many students dropped a level, so you see the blue getting smaller, and many of the students who were in the blue are not as high in the blue as they were before. So they may have stayed in the blue, but the vast majority of kids did drop, particularly in math. If you look at the English only, those students were able to read at home, to continue with their English skills. So it didn't have the same impact on the students who speak English being at home and missing school as math, where they're not learning, because by the time they get to middle school, obviously, you're not teaching kids to read anymore. They're not learning to read, they're reading to learn. And so those foundational skills are not impacted in the same way that they would be in the lower grades. So what we notice is, as we've discussed, except at the primary school and the work they're doing in math, there's a larger achievement gap in math than in ELA. The transition from 5th to 6th, we also see remains difficult for all of our students, and it's especially noticeable among our Hispanic students, but it is a drop that we've seen for years among our entire school population. So what we typically see is the transition to 6th grade creates a drop, and then 7th grade we get back above actually where we were before, and then 8th grade. So we do end up overcoming that, but there is a big adjustment for kids coming to middle school. Site-wide at RLS, ELL status is the largest predictor of below standard CASP scores for many of the reasons that we've talked about. And again, I just want to reiterate what Mr. Aurelio said, which is that the English language learners, unless they have an IEP, they do not get any modifications. They only get accommodations. And to tap onto what Rebecca said, the accommodations are not always super useful, because also at our level, the majority of our Spanish-speaking students are not actually literate in terms of reading and writing in Spanish. They speak Spanish very fluently at home, but it's generally talking with your family and your friends. It is not academic Spanish. And so they are in that many of them are kind of in that in-between area where they haven't quite gotten to the academic level in English, and they never have had the academic in Spanish. So our heritage Spanish classes at the middle school really focus the students who take that on the reading and the writing part of Spanish, because they already speak it, but they don't have the academic Spanish, with very few exceptions. English only is a more significant predictor of met and exceeded than is race. And again, that's the language piece that makes it really hard for students. And so next steps are working with the 5th and 6th grade staff to identify and eliminate barriers in the middle school transition, especially for Hispanic students. We had a meeting last week with our 5th grade teachers coming over to talk with the 6th grade English teachers specifically about the transition in English language arts and writing skills, so that we started that before the pandemic, and it's unfortunately one of the many things that just as we were trying to get through and survive kind of went by the wayside. And so we're again trying to do a much better job of aligning and creating a smoother transition from elementary school to middle school to hopefully assist with that transition drop that we've traditionally always seen. Continuing to intensify focus on supporting English language learner students. We work on our master schedule every single year. I sit down with the math teachers in particular and the English language development teacher to talk about how we can use the resources that we have most effectively with the student population that comes in. The schedule changes every single year. depending on what the needs are of the students who come in. We try to be really flexible about putting people where we can to offer the kind of supports that are necessary. Some years we need more in math, some years we need more in language arts, and working to be flexible with that. Also using data analysis to help us make those decisions, and the teachers are use strategic instructional strategies to help support those students in classes, and the English language coordinator really helps with that, meets with the teams regularly and talks about specific students and offered specific strategies to meet the needs of individual students. So we're fortunate that we're really small and we know all of the students individually, so we're able to pivot and help people where we need to. A potential next step is considering teacher training in English language learning or culturally responsive strategies specifically for math. So we have done it with West Ed in a broader way, and to be honest, I don't know if there's anything out there, but since we continue to see the gap affecting our population who isn't an English only group more so, I'm looking into possible ways to better support specifically within mathematics. And then we are not as far along as the primary school with PLCs. We just started last year, and last year was really just an introductory on Zoom year. So this is the first year we've really actually started diving into it. But there's so much amazing potential for really being intentional about using PLCs, as Rebecca was talking about, to better align instruction and also to identify and address individual learning gaps. Not only the learning gaps, but the students who are above and need additional support to get as far as they can. So right now, what we're really focusing on is using access period, and we have that time already built into the schedule. I think we do a pretty good job of using access period well now, especially for the students who need to have some extra help with a teacher. But we're looking at how we can use that time to support students who don't need extra help but actually need extensions, and how we can be more how we can better plan for how to extend the lessons for the kids who don't need any of the extra subject pull out, while still allowing that for the kids who do. So again, it's trying to use our resources as effectively as we can so that we can meet the needs of every student at RLS. Any questions?
I have a question also. I guess I'm really struggling with the transition from 5th to 6th grade. It sounds like you guys you're trying to collaborate on it. I guess fundamentally, are you saying that the students, it's not just this year?
No.
It's always something that happens. So the kids test well. I know it's just a test, but since that's what we're looking at, test well in 5th grade, and then they don't test well in 6th.
It is a different test.
So it's a different state test,
Yes.
but isn't. So the format is different because every year it is a different test, right? So I'm
right.
I'm
And
just
well, for the map,
struggling
I'm
to
sorry.
understand the.
Right, I'm sorry, I wasn't being very clear. So on the map, it's actually a completely different test. So the map goes K5.
Yes.
And then 6+. So part of the conversation is considering whether we should be using the map differently in 6th grade and perhaps not giving the 6+ in 5th grade, but instead doing the K5 so that we can see the elementary gaps more clearly, rather than focusing on the middle school gaps, which they haven't had yet. I don't think I said that very well.
So the data that we are looking at
That's
map?
CASP. That's CASP map.
Okay.
And traditionally, yes, there's always been a big gap between a drop in 5th grade, a drop from 5th grade to 6th grade, and then going back up after that.
It's not a
Did I-
different, it's not a different test, Sean.
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
the
I think I
state-
said that wrong,
It's
so
a
I
state
apologize.
test. It's just at 6th grade standards. So
I guess
as you go up in,
why
yeah.
every year should be harder because it's
Right,
different standards.
which it
I
is,
guess
right.
I'm struggling with why this always happens.
So are we.
Okay.
Could it, is it related
Is it
to,
across the state? Is
well,
it-
just the standards, a lift between 5th and 6th, the standards themselves? Is there a big leap there?
Right, it
W-
goes
Especially within
from,
mathematics?
it is a big leap. So the standards in 5th grade are primarily not as abstract. When you go to sixth grade, the standards become much more abstract. In the fifth grade, they're much more concrete. So in fifth grade, it's more of the basic skills, and in sixth grade, it becomes more about application. So that is part of it, certainly. What other parts are, part of it, I think, is just the transition that you see, and that is statewide. It's not just an RLS thing. It's pretty much across the board when kids switch from middle school. And one thing that we were talking about recently that I actually never had occurred to me before is that the 5th to 6th is the only transition that we can see in this district, because there is no test at 2nd. So we can't see if that happens from 2nd to 3rd, and there is no test at 9th, so we cannot see if there's a gap, if there's a drop between 8th and 9th. So the only scores that we have to highlight is 5th to 6th. Whether it happens before or not, we don't know. There aren't any CASP scores to tell that.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And it has been an ongoing. It is. It's been ongoing. Yep.
And I think one of my questions is, in looking at that, is for the ELL learners in math from 5th to 6th. I guess the question I had is, because math has become so language heavy, vocabulary heavy, does all of a sudden the curriculum really just get harder as well? And if you're struggling with the language that's not your first language in 5th grade, and then all of a sudden the concepts get harder, I'm assuming the language gets harder, the vocabulary gets harder. Would that also
all
attribute?
of that is accurate, and it is a different curriculum as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so we use Carnegie, which is quite language heavy, and I'm not familiar with what they use in the elementary school, but it is a different
Okay.
curriculum
But that's
for sure.
curriculum, not the test. I just
Right, the
And yes,
curriculum.
the curriculum is much harder
Yeah.
when looking at it.
Yeah, it's very different. It's just a large adjustment all the way around, and for years we've been trying to look at that and figure out what is causing that, because the teachers are doing a great job. You can go into the classroom and see them implementing all of the strategies that they've been taught and doing all of the things that they need to do to reach the students, but it just isn't translating to test scores. And your guess, Sean, is, I don't know. I wish I knew. I wish I could wave a magic wand and figure it out, but as I said, it's a statewide phenomenon as well.
Yeah, thank you. Since our focus, one of our focus is looking at the achievement gap with our EL students and our Caucasian students, I'm thinking about the way that ELs, what I've recently learned, and how ELs are supported at the high school, where there's a newcomer class, there's an EL level 1 class, an EL level 2 class. And also, not meaning to skip ahead, but noticing that all of the subcategories at the high school have met the level. Has there been discussion at the middle school level of providing specific ELA coursework the way that the high school does it? Is that possible? And if you haven't had a conversation on that yet, that I don't need any sort of answer. I was just curious.
I'm just not entirely sure I know what you're asking. We do have designated ELD classes that are leveled. Is that what you're asking? We already do that, and for 6th graders, in addition, they have the identified language learners have an English class, a regular English class, as well as an ELD class.
That's great. Ben,
Right.
could you speak on that? Because it's ELA classes specifically for EL status students, depending on their status.
We have that. That's what we have.
The English language, so they have a different English language class.
In addition, so they have it in an additional English language. So they're not being pulled from their regular English language arts class. They have an additional class that's focused on language development.
Okay, so an English language. So then why at the high school, again, I'm using the scores to help me understand, because at the high school, the students have a designated EL, English Language Arts class every morning. Does that support the level met scores for CASP? That's a question I don't know if we can answer, but it's interesting that why are our students only receiving EL support in their English Language Arts at the high school level? Why is that not happening?
That's not true. They are getting it.
They're getting in. I know they're getting in like an ELD class.
Which is the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also within the class, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah,
So
and
it's
they're
called
also-
integrated. They're also getting it within the class.
And at the high school, they have an ELA class because they don't receive ELD electives. Is that why it's different?
That is their ELD class. It's the same thing.
Okay, but it's one class at the high school and it's two at the middle school.
No, it's one class at the, so English language arts is separate from English language development.
Yes, yeah. I know
So
that.
both at the high school and at RLF, and at all the other sites actually, if
Yeah.
a student is an English language learner, they get a designated English language development.
Yes,
In our
I'm familiar with
class
that.
every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
It's time in the day at the other schools,
Yeah.
but for us, they get a class every day. And in addition, they get their regular, with their peers, grade level English language class that applies to the high school.
Not all.
Unless they're like a newcomer. Unless they're a newcomer, but if they're 12 plus at the high school and also for us.
Okay.
I'm just not 100% sure what you're asking.
No, you totally clarified it for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank
Okay.
you.
And if there is more, maybe you can meet separately, but I'm gonna respect everybody's time because we have to have a closing conversation and Mr. Cinto needs to go next. So, any other questions, hold on to them and then we'll circle back at the end, okay?
We could just gloss over the high school. That's all right. I have a really quick supplement.
Of course.
Only because, Mary did such a great job in terms of the other data report, but I know Mr. Heller kind of forecasted that we're looking at Hispanic versus white. And then in terms of looking at cohorts, I've also gone on and provided Howell Mountain, Pope Valley data, as well as DOC data, because obviously Mr. Heller indicated, one or student can be 1 or 2 percentage points. So it's really important to look at all of the students coming to the high school in the 11th grade, given that we take students from many other areas. And you could look at that later as well. So obviously, great shining star is our English language arts performance, which every student subgroup exceeds the state minimum, which is really, really awesome. It's also to be noted that our English language arts are supported by all subject matters. Lisa, you kind of took my thunder in terms of talking about the increased language demands of mathematics. But when you think about science, social studies, even elective courses, they're all reading, writing, speaking, listening. So you think about the support for achievement in English language arts, as much as I think our English language arts teachers are amazing, they have a whole nother cast of characters that are supporting their work with students, even counselors and the workshops they hold, and how to write a college acceptance or college essay. Who's talking to your mic? Oh, if I turned it on. All right. We okay? All right. So yeah, we're really crushing it in English language arts, and as Mary said, the EL population, it's not that nobody's achieving, it's just not deemed a statistically significant subgroup. So anyways, and that's some of the data that I've provided you there, and I think one of the questions was about the accommodations and modifications. Important to note is how many of our EL students are also classified as special ed, because so few kids actually live in any one of these demographic categories. They live in many of them. So again, math achievement, obviously we know we're working on there. But again, everybody, and I know I've said this till I'm blue in the face, but math performance is really dependent on the course exposure. We know if you're not in integrated math 3 by the time you're a junior and achieving highly in integrated math 3, your chances of passing that test are very slim to none. Actually, I think in the few years that I've tracked it, maybe 1 or 2 students who's below a C, integrated math 3 has actually got met on the test. Which, if you think about backwards mapping standpoint, you don't even, if you're not planning to go in a STEM related field, you don't need to take integrated math 3. So many of our students are starting to choose statistics as a viable third year math if they're not majoring in a STEM based field, which is smart, right? I mean, they're taking courses for their future, not to achieve on the state test. So knowing that trend is actually increasing the number of juniors who are taking statistics, I mean, we would anticipate this trend to continue to some degree. because they just haven't been exposed to the content. I think that was it on that one, Mary. So this is socioeconomic, and this is one of the reasons why I kind of did on page 1 of my supplement, which corresponds to parent ed level. I know on page 28 in the documentation that Mary provided shows student performance on English language arts and math and how that correlates to parent ed level, which you would imagine would correlate to socioeconomic disability, right? The greater education you have, the more you can support your students. So as you'll see on Mary's page 28 as well as here, parents that have higher education can better support their students in both math and English, although we do know their ability to support their students in math is compromised. I think about even within my own home, both of us are college educated. There comes a point at which you can no longer support your kids in math effectively. I think we've heard that over and over throughout the years. We've held district-wide meetings on how to support your kids in elementary math because it's changed. And again, math impacted by course-taking behavior. Students, okay. So what are we going to do about it? I'm the short one. I only have 2 slides. What I'm really excited, I'm excited about all these things, but in accordance with the elimination of math advancement at RLS, we're going to be eliminating pre-integrated 1 math class here. I've actually surveyed some students about that change. I have their testimony here, which I'm actually going to read you. But these are students who have made it all the way to our higher end math class. So this is a student. I think students of color at SHS are reluctant to take higher level classes because they feel like they don't belong there, or aren't good enough to be in that class. And a lot of them are the first generation going to college, and they don't have much support from parents. Another student said, I felt like the white students were smarter because they were always in the advanced classes from the beginning. So back then I just thought they were way smarter than everyone else. Last student said, I think that with the new detracking, things will encourage students of color to take more difficult classes because there will be no preconception that they aren't as smart as other kids. They won't be discouraged or scared to take on those classes. So that's directly from our students. So that's really exciting that even now, just asking them that question, in retrospect, they see it as a positive, the change that we've made. We're going to continue to expand. I've actually provided the hyperlink, the executive summary. I apologize for my notes. But that's really taken off lately, and it's expanding. And I know at the 612, we had a recent vertical articulation, I think it was in January, where all teachers were looking at these new instructional strategies. And other departments have started using them as well where appropriate. I was in a chemistry class the other day where all students were working on a vertical white space, rotating the marker through so that everybody had to document their practices, and it was noticeable the impact that it had on students and their learning, because students that wanted to kind of sit in the back no longer could when they got their new marker, but you could read a little more there. We're working with Mr. Tom Lewis, who's the Director of Continuous Improvement at the county office. He's the one that was actually my math teacher when I was a 10th grader at Pittsburgh High School. And he is so jazzed by Bullet 2. He's listened to the book about 3 times on audiobook. He's read it twice. But there's really some revolutionary stuff in there, and it's catching on at the high school and beyond, even outside of mathematics. In looking to the future, and Corinne kind of foreshadowed this as well, where can we flex our staffing to better support our students in mathematics? So the district is, I think this is our 3rd or maybe 4th year with Avid MTSS professionals, and they have a little more leverage in their schedule of the type of students they can support. Corinne and I have worked over the years to kind of share and then identify one for each site. But how might we use them in our schedule to better support our students, particularly in mathematics? Because that's one of the biggest challenging areas, even for our existing paraprofessional support staff, who themselves are not that strong in mathematics. So using people that are more current with, pushing into other math classes to support EL students as well. This one's a big stretch, but there's momentum building. To increase our advocacy. The state holds board meetings, and myself and a couple of math teachers were actually feeling compelled to go take a visit to the state and kind of encourage them, and we've talked about this over the years, and I know David Chun, our previous math consultant, was here talking about hopefully they can consider changing the test to a more, there was rumor at some point in time that they were culling items, math items out of 10th grade, because that's when most schools, all students are at the same math level, versus the opportunity to do something different in 11th grade. So we're considering taking a field trip up to the state to go advocate for something better. And lastly, this is the first year that I've actually had an EL coordinator, so it's allowing me to kind of distribute that leadership and responsibility. Actually, after we leave here, we have a progress monitoring meeting for all of our reclassified students that we just had to determine next steps for them in terms of any additional support that they might need. That's what we're working on.
I have a question for the first bullet.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a little confused. I thought pre-Math 1 was for students who were not ready for Math 1.
Correct.
Not about, I didn't correlate to getting rid of advanced math at the middle school this year. So what are you saying is going to happen to students that aren't ready for Math 1? They're going to be in Math 1?
Mm-hmm. With additional support. So whether you call it acceleration or remediation, it's tracking both ways.
Okay.
So we didn't want to be hypocritical and say, oh, you need to, de-level your math at the middle school and then have level math at the high school. So we're really strategizing around what that looks like for the future and how we better support those students, knowing that, in all of these things, accrued mathematic deficiencies of basic skills are going to show their face at some point in time.
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
So knowing that, and even thinking about some of the voice of the things that our students had said about detracking, how do we then support our students, knowing that there's always going to be gaps, right? Outside of gestation, we know kids are going to achieve at different rates. So how do we strategize and potentially cluster those students in integrated Math 1 classes and look to our staffing in terms of MTSS, avid professionals, that we could have more adults in the room, a la math intervention, which we had years ago.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Heller, would you like to make any, comments, and then we can?
Yeah, I have a
through
couple
that.
of closing statements. First, I want to thank the principals and Mary that did an incredible amount of work and preparation to present the data and the work that they're doing. Not only have done in the past, but are starting to think about, and all that work is incorporated into their strategic plans that they present to the board and the community, as well as incorporated into the larger context into our LCAP. And so the achievement gap in mathematics, the board is aware, is one of our highest priorities within the LCAP. And we'll continue to get this information and help refine our goals and actions, for the plan that we're going to write here in the spring to bring to you in a first reading in May. One other final thing that I wanted to note in that bottom slide is that the TK8 staff is at various spots with the professional learning communities, and you've heard that conversation within their work. And this summer, Ben and Greg are going to take a cohort of high school staff to begin that process at the high school. So we'll be a district-wide professional learning community in future years, which is really exciting for us because we can embed all of our work with data and professional development within that professional learning community. So lots of good things ahead, but I would turn it back over to you for any final closing comments. Thank you for your time and participation today.
Absolutely, thank you. And yes, thank you. I'm going to give every trustee the opportunity to make some reflections if you would like to ask some clarifying questions. Our goal here is what can we do as a board to support our principals, who in turn support our teachers, who in turn serve our students, all of our students. So, Jean Marie, if you'd like to have anything to say, well, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, because, as a non-mathematics person, I wish I was more. I think it's fascinating, and it's a lot to absorb, and I'm sure I'll have lots of questions, because reading it's so much easier, not easier, for me, hearing it explained was much more clarifying than just, kind of looking at everything. And it's kind of interesting, some of the points you talked about too. Like, I grew up in a part of the world where they don't have middle school. It's a junior high type of thing. So it'd be interesting to kind of go back and look at, is there a big transition between sixth versus junior high, 7th and 8th grade, and all those things? But no, I greatly appreciate it. I think each one of the principals have just such great energy and ambition, and I think we're a very fortunate district. So thank you, and I'm sure I'll have questions for you later.
Well, I loved it all. I love the math. I love data. So this was very enlightening for me. I learned so much. I can't thank you enough. It was a lot of data, and the other attachment also. So I know a lot of time was spent. And I have more questions. I'll probably reach out to you guys or to Ruben. I think for me, one of my, I think this is not principles, but from a closing statement standpoint, one of the things I'd like to see is you guys have all these great things you're doing. So you have targets, you know what you're trying to achieve. I guess I'd like to see something like that on a closing statement. Like, we know what these problems are, we don't know what this problem is, and here's what we're working towards. So, because I know some of you did have that, but I would love to see that at this level so that we are able to see, track, and then how do we help you in our decision making meet those needs. I guess tying it back to LCAP and then decisions we make in the board is let me know or let us know how we can help you with that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and explanations and helping me with all the questions that I had. So I really appreciate that. And if the district office could explain to me, this meeting we have is an annual meeting where we will review their next steps next year to see how those are going, or like what is the next step for this discussion?
Ruben, do you mind me jumping in, or? Oh, go ahead. This is an annual meeting, and it usually starts at the beginning of the year. So we're having it a little late this year, but it is usually at the beginning of the year. What happens with all of the sites is that they'll be creating their strategic plan based on the data by the end of this year of where they're going to go next year for their plan. And their strategic plans come to us at the district level, that come to you in October. But while they're creating their district plan, we're creating the LCAP, which is the overarching strategic plan for the district that feeds into what they're doing at the grassroots level, up to us and back down. So it's all planning right now to ramp up for next year based on the data they have currently and what we'll get from the CASC and the LPAC going forward.
Okay, thank you.
As always, I'm always very appreciative of all of your work. I know you're in addition to providing data to us, you're with your colleagues and students, and there's always a lot going on, so I really appreciate your time. I really do. I also appreciate that, and this has been part of our district for many years, is how it's where we're able to, I appreciate looking at the data, and then also how you have always been very forward thinkers as far as what's next and what we can do to help students help our students today and in the future. So I'm really appreciative of that, and for being so patient with our questions tonight. So thank you.
Yes, I can't say ditto. I realize that. So I love that we were able to put everybody's voice to the data, because it's hard to just read the data and think that we have the answers to all that. So again, thank you for everybody for your time and the input. I think as was reading this over the last few days, it was just like, okay, so how can we as partners, what can we do as a board to support your next steps and what you want to do? And some of the things, I know I look like a crazy lady here with all of my, all of my notes, but, I think it is about the interventions. Do you need more help and support, whether by people or materials in interventions? Is that something that you want the board to consider as we move forward in curriculum development and budgeting? Do we need to find those kind of avenues. So I just want you to know that I think that's the mindset that we're trying to find to help you. You know, it's, you get the information to the superintendent needs to bring it to us. And then we in turn will ask the questions of Ruben to see how we can really make you feel like you're supported. Because as much as there are gaps, as much as everybody wants to see improvement, you know, we really have to take a look at this data and think 2.5 years were interrupted. Just with the pandemic alone, not including other things that happened to our valley and our community. And there's a lot of great things in there. There's things to be proud of. There is growth, you know, and we know that it's one moment in time measurement, and we have to take care of the whole kid. We're worried about, you know, their mental health. We're worried about their social reentry into grades, into their grade levels, into their school community. So I was looking at this going, okay, you know, we're one of the more fortunate districts. We've got some great stuff going on. We obviously have very dedicated staff to seeing our kids improve. So thank you for that. And I think, you know, one of the things that I have from my Post-it notes here that I'll follow up with the superintendent is, you know, are these things the board should consider, whether it's in budgeting, whether it's in programming, that we can make sure that you guys feel supported. And I would hope the same thing, you feel that way to whether it's with Mr. Heller in the Math Alignment Committee or the teachers speaking to their principals. I really hope that those conversations get to happen for you all, because it's important. And then, you know, if it needs to come to us, I would hope that we would be able to support you as well. So thank you so very much for taking the time and putting it all together. Honestly, very grateful for that. I don't really have any other questions. I think one other question, though, Mr. Cinto, there's no more pushing in? No more pushing into the math classes? Okay, did that went away when COVID, I mean, obviously with COVID, but it didn't come back?
No.
Okay, that's just one of my last clarifying. So I'll end there, and Mr. Aurelio, if you would like to say something? Or?
Yeah, I just want to really appreciate the staff for all the work. I know how much work went into putting all of this together, and of course the day-to-day work that our principals do. And yeah, we should give Mary like a round of applause, because that's a lot of data to put together in a comprehensive way. And of course, you know, with any type of data, you can slice it so many different ways. And we can go down a rabbit hole. But I do appreciate, I just want to say, I appreciate that our principals are looking at the data not solely at an aggregate level, but really focused in on different student groups. And the reality is, for them, they're looking at it by student by name. You know, we use these categories, but they know each and every individual student and the student needs, and that's where the real work happens at the school level. And, you know, we're here to support them, and, you know, it's great to hear what works. It's also good to hear what might need to be tweaked a little. So we hope that dialogue continues.
Agree. I think the one thing I did hear that maybe the trustees would like, and when you're available to do so, is to provide us a list of what accommodations and modifications look like. Okay, that would, I
I
think.
just
that was-
sent it to Ruben and
Okay,
Chris.
perfect.
It's in my email.
Okay.
I've been focused on this.
Okay,
Meeting.
okay, no, that's great, perfect, okay. I think then with that, if there's nobody other comments that, in closing, I think we are able to adjourn this meeting. So I'm gonna go back here and say, do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I'll make a motion to adjourn today's meeting.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Aurelio, would you like to do a roll call vote, please?
Trustee Wolf,
Aye.
Trustee Mora,
Aye.
Trustee Simon,
Aye.